All right, we're back on Morning Line. Nick Barris along with News Channel 5 legal analyst Nick Leonardo talking about some of the high-profile legal cases. Phone calls coming in real quick, and we're also streaming live on Facebook at newschannel5.com. A couple quick questions. Hit those, and we'll get to the phone calls as well on the plus here. One person, several people are saying, in the Daniel Hambrick case, look, if you just don't run from police and you cooperate with their commands, you're not going to get shot. All right, now, man, I'm not going to dispute. You should obey an officer's commands. But if you don't, that doesn't give the officer just license to blow you away. I'm not saying that necessarily happened in this case, but if you don't, unless there's a threat, you don't deserve to get shot simply because you don't immediately comply with an officer's commands. That's my take, and you've got to agree with that. It's wrong if maybe you don't, but there's different reasons why people don't always comply. What do you think of that?
I mean, that raises a good point. However, we have had some police-involved shootings where they weren't running and they were recorded, and so that was on TV. And then I think you have to be sensitive to the cultural or environmental component to this to some degree, but it's not a guarantee that if you comply with officers' commands, this won't happen.
Right. Oh, that's true. But my point is, comply, and if you don't, you may get arrested for not complying, but just because you don't comply in the absence of threat, you should not be shot. End of story, period. Let's not even debate that. The other question, some people asking whether or not there's a speedy trial. I mean, everyone hears about you have a right to a quick and speedy trial, which I've asked you this before, and you explained to me why sometimes there are such lengthy delays. But doesn't the defendant have a right to demand a speedy trial as best as possible? Sure. I mean,
that's the defendant's right, the one who's charged with the crime, to a speedy trial. However, I've never met a defense attorney that didn't welcome a continuance, especially in a case where the punishment could be so severe. But there's a lot of evidence to go over, and depending on what comes out, what the state provides to defense counsel in discovery, and we've heard just snippets, the media's caught, that defense counsel may have some evidence, that they want to introduce that could be provocative, and so the court will spend a lot of time looking over what's going to be admissible and what is not going to be admissible, so they can kind of narrow down the scope of the evidence that's going to be introduced. But I would say that, as far as a speedy trial, just what happened during the period of time from the preliminary hearing to the indictment, he's definitely been on a fast track in this case. Yeah, to this point. But as you say, it could be 18 months before a trial for Delkey. But here's the thing, he doesn't have to push for a speedy trial necessarily, even though I'm sure he'd like to see this resolved, because he's free right now. He's out on bond. Maybe a different ballgame if you're locked up and you're like, let's move forward faster because I don't want to stay locked up. I feel I'm innocent. Well, or maybe after the preliminary hearing, he's in this what they call bound over status. It's been bound over to the grand jury, and he's just sitting out there for 18 months with nothing happening. Right. Then I think you're looking at more of a speedy trial violation. Right. Let's go to some phone calls. We'll start off with Joe. Joe, good morning to you.
Good morning, Nick.
Hey, Joe, you know where I was yesterday? We went to the memorial for Sheriff Darren Hall's father, and the people there actually were talking about you, and they followed the show closely, and they wanted to let you know that you'd be welcome to come to the funeral if you wanted to.
Well, I was sorry I couldn't make it because I had 2 previous appointments for myself, a doctor's appointment and a dentist appointment, so I'm sorry I didn't make it, and I'm condolences to the Hall family, and it's devastating. I know it's Darren. Yeah. Him and his father were real close.
Well, and I wanted to mention that again, and today is the funeral for Durwood Hall, who is a good man. I got to know him, former councilman. So anyway, they know you and I talk a lot about it with the sheriff when he's on, and our thoughts and prayers are with the Hall family, and the sheriff's doing fine. He's okay. So go ahead, Joe. What's your question?
Okay. I have one comment to make on this case here. I think it's 2 things that's pushing this case. The district attorney has got political ambitions. This is the first time I can remember in quite a while, even in the Vanderbilt rape case, where the district attorney himself was presenting the case and pushing the case when he's got 2 able assistant district attorneys to do the court work for him. So,
okay, let's hit on this. We have a lot of questions. I want you to roll through it. All right. Politics. It's a component on that. And secondly, he's right. Tory Johnson, the DA prior to him, at the end there was more or less an administrator, very rarely tried cases. Glenn Funk, a litigator as well, but he'll get involved, and there's nothing wrong with that at all if he chooses to prosecute himself. Have Roger May as his right-hand man. Of course, Tom Thurman's... Roger Moore, I'm sorry. Roger May is another attorney, but of course Tom Thurman's no longer there.
Right.
So, but go ahead on that. Just your take on how politics can play a role in some of these high-profile cases.
Well, I think it's important to point out to Joe's comment that General Funk inherited the Vanderbilt rape cases.
That's true.
Okay, I mean, he didn't initiate the prosecution, but he is an elected official. But I would be very, very cautious before I would ever suggest that politics would interfere with the decisions to, whether or not a crime has been committed and whether or not they ought to prosecute a case like that. I just be very, very cautious about it. A lot of people are saying that, but at this point, I'm not willing to jump out there and say that I believe it's a political prosecution.
Okay. All right.
And we do have some political prosecutions, but I don't think this is one of them.
Yeah, it doesn't. But sometimes there's, against the backdrop, there's always, because let's face it, the reason we have a community oversight board, which is a political thing, is because of these officer-involved shootings.
Sure.
That was the trigger for it. So let's go next to Evan. Evan, good morning. Hi, Evan.
Hey, hello, fellow Lion Man.
Hello. How are you?
He thinks that the case that the issue whenever there's a cop shooting, it's usually a minority African American. Is something prosecutors like Kathy Morante should look at?
In terms of looking at the race of those involved in a shooting?
Yes, whenever I hear of a cop shooting, it's a minority African American. I've never heard of it being a poor white person or Hispanic or an Asian. It's usually a minority black person. We have Black Lives Matter. We don't have Poor Lives Matter or Hispanic Lives Matter. Okay,
well, all lives, of course, do matter. Look, I've covered stories where white suspects have been shot and killed by police. So every race has been shot and killed. And I guess his point, though, is it seems like the whole Black Lives Matter, that there's the perception out there among many that there are more black men, especially, being shot and killed by police officers.
Well, I mean, it seems like when you turn on the TV, that's what you see. But of course, again, there are other people being killed by the cops, but obviously disproportionately it does appear that is the situation.
Right, and that's the perception of it. But yeah, let's face it, law enforcement sometimes has to use their weapons, and and when it's justified, the race of the person it doesn't play a role. The question is, in some of these cases, was it justified? And that's what the courts will have to decide. Let's go to Cindy. Hi, Cindy. Good morning, Cindy.
Good morning, Nick.
Hey.
Yeah, I'm going to flip the script on him a little bit.
Yeah.
I know y'all are just talking about, cases that are coming up, but I don't know. I'm not a juror, and I really don't pay much attention on what they're trying to tell me to think. Okay, but the one thing I wanted to ask him, if he's a legal person, lawyer, is what about, you ain't going to go out there and act all crazy and shoot a gun or whatever, but what do you do when people are purposely emptying their swimming pool in the jacuzzi when one of them has 32 inches of your property that they put a fence on, and they keep sneaking over to fix it? And number two is, what in the world do you do when you've called the health department and everything else? The only thing I know to do is get a bulldozer.
Probably don't want to get a bulldozer and hit someone else's property. That's kind of off point, but people file lawsuits all the time against neighbors in small claims court and things like that.
I mean, I didn't know if that was a metaphor or if that was an actual legal question.
Pool issue, and
sounds like a property boundary dispute. And there's a lot of lawyers out there that'll talk to you for free. So I might try to find a lawyer and see what they suggest.
Yeah, and you can, there's an issue, small claims court, right? What is that? General Sessions.
General Sessions. That's exactly right. Up to $25,000.
Happens all the time, Cindy. You can go there, but that's a little off topic. Let's go next to Ann. Ann, good morning.
Good morning.
Hey.
I wanted to ask his opinion on legislation that's is brought forth right now in reference to the Community Oversight Board. If legislation is passed that will change the way the demographics is set up for our Community Oversight Board, and by this I mean if Metro employees are allowed to serve on it the next time a board is elected, that will open the door for all 30-plus boards in Metro to have paid employees serve on those 30-plus boards in Metro. And that would also open the door for all districts in the state of Tennessee, as the legislation, the way it is written now, impacts the entire state of Tennessee.
Any thoughts on that? I don't know how familiar you are with some of the legislation going on up there.
Well, so I know that it's moving forward. The legislation that's going to alter the COB that was, passed by the Metro, the referendum that we had here, and a couple of the things I know that they're looking at. One was the quote-unquote subpoena power that the board may have. Metro does not have the ability to give themselves subpoena power, and so that was one of the issues they were looking at. But I think, and I'm not sure about the Metro employee issue, but one of the issues that I think is interesting is that they want to remove the fact through this legislation that 4 members of this board have to be from an at-risk or an economically deprived community, and I think that that's problematic. I'm not so sure why the focus is necessarily on that, but if there's a part of this legislation that would allow paid metropolitan workers to be on a volunteer board, then I think she's right. It does open it up for the IDB board, the sexually oriented business board, the planning commission, and all these other things. And I think that would be a mistake, or definitely a conflict of interest for a paid Metro employee to be on these quasi-judicial boards. But that legislation is currently moving.
Still moving along. Listen, we got to take a break. When we come back, more of your calls. We've got some lines open. Jim and others stay there. When we come back, too, I'll have an update for you both on the Little Joe Clyde Daniels case, as well as where we stand on the Holly Bobo case, with one defendant still sitting in Riverbend Maximum Security Prison. We'll touch on those and take more of your calls and questions on Facebook at newschannel5.com right after this.